The chain bit into the bark on his left. His right wrist twisted against the steel link and stayed there bent at the kind of angle that told you something inside had already given. The blood did not pour. It came in a slow pulse, one drop at a time, falling from the crook of his wrist and landing in the pine dirt below his feet. Each drop made a dark circle in the dust, then another like a clock that had decided to count down instead of up. His name was Virgil Hatch. He was 64 years old. He had been on the road for 22 years, and somewhere around year 5, he had stopped being afraid of dying. What he felt now, chained to a tree in a stand of pines so thick the sky above him was nothing but a thin gray ribbon between the tops, was not fear. It was something quieter than fear. It was the particular stillness of a man who has run out of options and has decided to stop pretending otherwise. The duct tape across his mouth turned his breathing into a dull, papery sound. His knees had buckled once already. The chain had caught him before he went all the way down. A branch cracked somewhere in the trees, then another, closer. He knew what was coming back. Patient men always come back to check their work. Then from behind him, from the dark space between the trees that the men had not come from, a sound rose. Low, settled. It was not a warning. It was not a question. It was the sound of something that had already made up its mind. Virgil Hatch lifted his head. I am going to tell you what that dog did next, but first you need to understand who the man was. Because what happened on that mountain was not a story about loyalty in the abstract. It was a story about two specific beings, both of them broken in specific ways, and what those breaks made possible between them. 3 days before that chain went around his wrists, Virgil Hatch was in the gravel lot behind his shop on the eastern edge of a small city in the Appalachian foothills, hosing down the side of his bike. He moved the way men of his build move at 64, deliberately, without waste. His hands were the first thing you noticed about him if you were paying attention. They were covered in tattoos so old the ink had gone from black to a deep bruised blue, the kind of color that stops looking like art and starts looking like topography. They were big hands, calloused across the base of every finger. The hands of a man who had spent 4 decades knowing the inside of an engine the way other men know the inside of a familiar room. He could find a loose valve in the dark by feel alone. He had done exactly that more than once in circumstances he did not describe to people he had not known for at least a decade. His beard was silver and came down to his chest. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale and without much warmth on the surface. The kind of eyes that made strangers look away first without knowing exactly why. He had been the chapter's sergeant-at-arms for 11 years. Before that, he had been the kind of patch holder that other patch holders watched without seeming to watch, the kind of man whose opinion shifted the temperature of a room without him saying a word. He had done things in his 22 years on the road that he could not say out loud in a church or in a courtroom or to his daughter. He had never been convicted of anything that mattered. He had never once regretted the work itself. What he regretted was different. What he regretted was the way the work had taken up the space where other things were supposed to go. His wife Margaret had died 11 years ago. A problem with her heart that had been there for years before either of them knew it. He had been in another state when it happened, handling something for the chapter that could not wait and that he could not explain over a phone. The person who called him with the news was his daughter Kay, who was 27 at the time. Kay had not cried on the phone. She had been very calm, the way people are sometimes calm when they have spent a long time expecting something terrible and it has finally arrived. She said, "Dad, Mom is gone." He said nothing for a moment. She said, "I told her you would not make it back in time." Then she hung up. Kay was 38 now. She lived in Portland. He had not spoken to her in 3 years, not since the last call, which had been brief and had ended the same way. Most of their calls ended, which was with silence, spreading across the line until one of them ran out of patience with it. He did not blame her. He understood what he had been as a father. He understood it the way you understand a road you have already driven the wrong direction down, clearly and too late to do anything about it. He did not think about this while he washed the bike. He had learned over many years not to think about it while he was working, but it was always there, a low-frequency hum behind everything else. What he thought about on that particular morning was the photograph on the wall just inside the shop door. It was a picture of a bung, a yellow Labrador, older in the photo, with a graying muzzle and ears that had gone soft with age. The name written in pen on the back of the photograph, though you could not see it from the front, was Hank. Hank had died 10 years ago. He had not died the way old dogs die. He had been left on the threshold of this shop in the early morning before Virgil arrived. It was a message, the kind of message that certain people send when they want to make something clear without saying it out loud. The message had been received. The people who sent it had been dealt with in the way that the chapter dealt with such things. But Virgil had not owned another dog for 7 years after that. Not because he did not want one, because he understood what it meant to have something that mattered in the kind of life he lived. The photograph stayed on the wall because taking it down felt like something he was not willing to do. But he never talked about it. The men who had been in the chapter long enough knew not to ask. Which was why when he finally brought another dog home, he put a blanket over the animal's head in the sidecar before he pulled into his street. Not because he was ashamed of what he was bringing home, because he did not want anyone to see it. He did not want anyone to be able to point to it later and say that is the thing that matters to him. The dog's name was Atlas. Atlas was lying in a patch of sun at the edge of the gravel lot when Virgil finished with the hose that morning. 7 years old, Belgian Malinois. Black mask over a tan and dark face with the kind of compact musculature that looked like it was resting until the moment it wasn't. The lean density of an animal that had been built for one purpose and had spent its life fulfilling it. There were 2 scars on his left shoulder from a knife, a notch in his right ear where a bullet had passed through, missing by the width of a finger. And inside the flap of that same ear, faded with age and partially obscured by the notch, was a tattoo, a service number, the kind that working police dogs receive so they can be identified if they come back without their handlers. Atlas had spent the first 4 years of his life as a police K-9 in a state that Virgil had never said out loud and did not plan to. His handler had been an officer named Dale Prentice, and Dale Prentice had been shot and killed in the stairwell of a housing complex during a raid that went wrong in the first 30 seconds. Atlas had been in that stairwell. He had stayed beside Prentice until the backup team arrived. He could not be moved. When they finally got him out, he would not work with anyone else. Not the officer who tried to take over his training, not the handler brought in from a neighboring county, not anyone. 6 months in the kennel, refusing food some days, just waiting for something that was not coming back. The department made a decision. Atlas was going to be put down. This is the only time I will explain this part because it only needs explaining once. Belgian Malinois trained for police work do not just learn commands. They learn architecture. They learn the route from the squad car to the door and back again. They learn the scent of every person on their team, learn to distinguish threat from familiarity in a fraction of a second, and they form attachments that do not transfer. When a Malinois bonds with a handler and that handler is gone, the dog does not simply reassign that bond. It waits. And when the wait becomes indefinite, the dog becomes something that a working kennel cannot sustain. Virgil heard about Atlas from his cousin's wife, who worked dispatch in the county where the dog was being held. He drove 11 hours in a single stretch. He paid the kennel fee in cash. He put the dog in the sidecar, draped his old leather jacket over the animal's back, and drove home without stopping. For the first 3 months, Atlas slept under the workbench in the shop and growled at every person who walked past the door. Virgil did not try to pet him, did not try to coax him out. He left food near the bench and water beside it, and every evening he laid his leather jacket on the floor nearby, the inside of it carrying the accumulated smell of him, his skin and his oil and his particular mix of cigarette smoke and engine grease. He went home at night and came back in the morning, and the food was gone, and the jacket had been moved slightly, and that was all. On the 90th night, Atlas came out from under the bench, walked to the foot of the bed, in the back room where Virgil sometimes slept when a job ran late, and lay down. He did not move until morning. That was it. That was how it happened. No ceremony, no moment of dramatic breakthrough. Just a dog deciding on the 90th night that the man with the leather jacket was the thing he had been waiting for. After that, wherever Virgil went, Atlas went. To the shop, to the road, to the chapter's Wednesday night meetings in the bay room of a cigar bar 2 miles from downtown. The other patch holders learned quickly not to make sudden movements near Virgil's bike because the dog in the sidecar did not bark. It only looked at you. And there was a quality to that look when the dog decided to use it a certain way that made grown men with histories of violence step back without quite understanding why their feet had done that. Virgil kept Atlas's old K9 vest folded in the left saddlebag. He never put it on the dog for show. He just kept it there clean and pressed the way you keep something that belongs to a person who is not coming back. He never explained why. The men who had been around long enough did not ask. Now, the trouble. There was a man in the chapter named Brett Macklin. Macklin was in his early 50s, loud in the way that insecure men are loud, and built like someone who had spent a lot of time making sure other people knew exactly how large he was. He had been a patch holder for 7 years. He was the kind of man who wore the chapter's colors the way some men wear a suit to a job interview, like a credential, like something that made him something rather than something that required him to be something first. 6 months before this morning, Virgil was hosing down his bike after a Wednesday chapter meeting that had ended earlier than usual. Macklin had caught Virgil alone in the back parking lot. He did not stand in front of Virgil. He positioned himself slightly to the side, the stance of a man who wants to have a conversation without it looking like a confrontation. "Virgil," he said, "you and I are about the same age. We understand things the younger guys don't. There are opportunities coming, opportunities that don't need to involve anyone else." Virgil did not look at him. He was wiping down the bike's left mirror with a cloth he kept in his jacket pocket. He had been wiping the same spot for the past 30 seconds. "Brett," he said, "what exactly are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you want to retire comfortable." Virgil folded the cloth. He looked at Macklin for the first time in the conversation. It was a brief look, flat and direct and carrying no particular warmth. In the sidecar, Atlas had turned his head toward Macklin. Macklin took 2 steps backward before he understood that his feet had done it without being told. Virgil started the bike and left. He did not report that conversation to Owen Gear immediately. He filed it. He watched. Because Virgil had been sergeant at arms long enough to know that what a man says in a parking lot is usually the edge of something larger, and the edge is not the place to make your move. What he found over the following weeks was larger. Macklin had opened a supply line through 2 state lines. Pills moving in quantities that required organization and multiple transit points in the kind of discretion that patches who owed him favors could provide. The money was not going on any books that the chapter kept. It was going into accounts that no one had voted to create, and several of the chapter's younger prospects had been pulled in one errand at a time until they were far enough down the road that saying no had become complicated. One of those prospects was a 24-year-old from Morgantown, West Virginia, named Travis Boone. Travis had come to the chapter 8 months earlier with a handshake and a work history that was mostly honest and a look in his eyes that Virgil had seen before on young men who came from nowhere much and wanted something that felt solid. His father had worked the mines. His mother had died when he was 12. He was not looking for power. He was looking for the thing that power sometimes approximates, which is belonging. Macklin had seen that in Travis within the first 10 minutes, the way a certain kind of man always spots the particular shape of what a younger man is hungry for. Travis had been used 3 times, moving packages from a point to a point without being told what the packages contained, though any man with common sense and a county sheriff's presence of mind could have worked it out. On the third run, sitting in his truck in the parking lot of a gas station with a fold of cash on his knee, Travis had understood exactly what he had become. He had gone to Macklin the following day. "I want out," Travis told him. Macklin listened. He was patient. He let Travis finish. Then he said, "You've done it 3 times, son. I've got photographs. I've got your name on 2 shipping invoices. If I go down, you go down. That's how brothers work." Travis drove away with his hands tight on the wheel and said nothing to anyone. But he started watching, paying attention to the shape of what Macklin was building, to the names attached to it, to the direction it was heading. He was not brave enough to go to the chapter with what he knew not yet, maybe not ever. But he held it. He carried it the way you carry something you don't know what to do with, carefully, so it doesn't break before you figure it out. 2 weeks before the phone call that would change everything, Travis Boone drove across town to the east side, parked his truck on the street in front of Virgil's shop, walked to the front door and stood there. He stood there for 15 minutes. The shop door had a window in its upper half, and the glass was old and slightly warped, but you could see through it clearly enough if you knew where to look. Virgil saw him from inside. He had been at the workbench rebuilding a carburetor for a customer, and he had looked up, and there was Travis Boone standing on the stoop with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set in the particular way of a man trying to work up to something. Virgil set down the tool he was holding. He watched. Atlas was under the bench. He lifted his head and looked at the door, then looked at Virgil. Virgil waited. Travis stood there for 15 minutes. Then he turned around and walked back to his truck and drove away. Virgil stood at the window for a moment after the truck was gone. Then he sat back down at the bench. He said quietly to the dog under it, "That kid wanted to say something." He did not call Travis. He did not follow up. He was the sergeant at arms. The protocol, the one he had operated by for 11 years, was to observe first and act on information, not on the vague unease of a man standing outside a door and then leaving. He had learned long ago that acting on impression rather than fact was the shortest road to a mistake you couldn't walk back. But he thought about Travis Boone that evening, and the evening after. He thought about the particular quality of someone standing at a threshold and choosing not to cross it. He understood that feeling. He had felt it himself at different thresholds in different decades. He had not always chosen correctly. He filed it. He kept watching. What he found was enough. Names, license plates, dates, dollar amounts that corresponded to no approved chapter activity. A timeline that laid out on paper made the shape of the thing unmistakable. He took it to Owen Gear on a Tuesday afternoon. Gear was 62 years old and had been the chapter's president for 9 years. He was not a large man. He was not a particularly impressive man if you assessed him by surface. He was the kind of man who said almost nothing in any given conversation and made each thing he said carry the weight of a ruling. He and Virgil had known each other for 20 years in the way that two men can know each other without ever discussing the knowledge. It was a matter of accumulated trust built in increments over years of standing in the same rooms and making the same calls. Gear listened to all of it. He asked one question when Virgil finished. "You sure?" Virgil said yes. Gear nodded once. 2 days later, Macklin and 4 of his people were called in. The chapter's colors were taken. They were given 24 hours to clear out of any property connected to the chapter and to remove themselves from any table flying the chapter's flag. No explanation was offered beyond the fact of the decision. No appeal was entertained. Macklin did not argue. He did not plead. He stood through the entire proceeding without looking at Gear once. He kept his eyes on Virgil. Not with fury, not with the hot rage of a man who has just lost something, with the particular steadiness of a man who is memorizing the specific shape of what he plans to address later. They were given until the following evening to clear out. They did not disappear. They went south to a county where nobody patrolled the back roads with any regularity, and they started planning. Virgil knew this. Owen Gear knew it. The chapter knew it as a fact of the situation, the way you know a storm is building by the color of the sky, by the way the air changes before anything visible has happened. The first sign was a brick through the shop window. Early morning. No witnesses. Virgil had walked in to find the glass on the floor and the brick in the middle of it with a piece of electrical tape wrapped around the middle. No note, no need for one. The second was a phone call at 3 in the morning. He picked up and there was breathing, and then a voice he did not recognize said one sentence. "We know where the dog sleeps." Then the line went dead. Virgil sat in the dark for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he got up and moved Atlas's bed from the front of the shop to the back room, where the walls were cinder block, and the single window was too high and too narrow for anything useful. He started keeping a sawed-off under the lip of the workbench behind the front leg, where it was invisible unless you knew exactly where to reach. He told Gear plainly at the next Wednesday meeting that if something happened to him, the chapter needed to take responsibility for the dog. Gear looked at him for a moment. He said, "I'll take care of both of you while you're still here." 3 days later, the shop phone rang. It was a voice Virgil recognized. Gordon Pruitt had been a patch holder for 15 years before he retired and moved into a cabin up in the mountains to keep bees and get sober in that order. He was Virgil's age. They had ridden together on enough stretches of highway that Virgil had lost count of the miles. Pruitt's wife Helen had fed Virgil the best venison stew he had ever eaten both times he visited the cabin. He still talked about that stew. It was the kind of detail that stays with you. The voice on the phone said Helen was dying, said it was cancer, said Pruitt needed Virgil to come up for just an hour, that there was something he needed to give him before it was too late, something he could not talk about over the phone. Virgil held the receiver and listened. And while he listened, he knew. He knew the cadence was off. Gordon Pruitt was a man who talked with energy, who moved through sentences the way he moved through a room with a forward momentum that you could hear even on a telephone. The voice on the other end paused too long between sentences. It placed its words too carefully. It was doing an impression of Gordon Pruitt rather than being him. Virgil knew. He also knew this: if he was wrong, if Helen was actually dying and Gordon was actually asking for him, and he did not go, he would carry that for the rest of his life. He had not been there when Margaret died. He had made a choice that day for the chapter instead of for the person who needed him. He had been making that math for 22 years, and he understood the cost of it with a clarity that had only increased as he got older. He could not make that choice again, not for a man who had ridden 15 years beside him. Not on a phone call that might be a trick or might be a real emergency, and he had no way to know which. He stood in the shop with the receiver in his hand for what might have been 3 minutes. Atlas was under the bench. He had raised his head and was watching Virgil with the unblinking attention that the dog reserved for moments when the man he belonged to was working something through. Virgil thought about a specific afternoon at Pruitt's cabin 2 summers ago. Pruitt sitting on the front steps with a mug of tea, no longer drinking anything stronger, and saying, "Virgil, you know what I learned after 15 years? I learned to tell the difference between when to stay and when to go. The hard part is that the difference isn't always obvious until you've already done it wrong." He set the receiver down. He took his jacket from the hook by the door. He reached into the lower drawer of the workbench for the sawed-off. The drawer caught. The workbench had been shifted slightly closer to the wall during the cleanup after the brick, and the drawer was jamming against the baseboard. He pulled once hard. It did not give. He thought about getting a pry bar. He thought about the time it would take. He put the drawer out of his mind. He had the smaller backup piece in the left saddlebag. That would do for a drive up to a friend's cabin in the mountains. He called Atlas out from under the bench. The dog came to him and he clipped the lead, which he almost never used, then unclipped it immediately. He opened the shop's back door and Atlas went to the sidecar without being told and stepped in and sat down in his riding position, ears up, spine straight. Virgil looked at the shop for a moment. The photograph of Hank on the wall near the door. The bench. The tools hanging above it in the order he had arranged them 20 years ago and had never rearranged. The old K9 vest folded in the saddlebag on the bike's left flank. He got on the bike. He started it. He went. What he did not know as he rode out of the lot and turned north toward the mountain roads was the full geometry of what he was riding into. He knew about Macklin. He understood in the abstract that the phone call was probably not Gordon Pruitt on the other end. He had accounted for the risk. What he had not accounted for was the part that came before the trap. What he did not know was that Gordon Pruitt and Helen Pruitt were not in a cabin on a mountain waiting for him. They had been gone for 2 days already, and no one had come looking because no one outside of Brett Macklin's plans knew to look. Travis Boone knew some of it, not all of it, enough to stand at a shop door for 15 minutes and then drive away because he was 24 years old and in too deep and had no idea how to be brave about it yet. The phone in the shop rang again 20 minutes after Virgil left. Nobody answered it. Nobody was there. Atlas rode in the sidecar with his ears up and his nose reading the air long before the mountain roads began to change. The fuel line had been loosened at the carburetor, not enough to kill the engine on flat ground, just enough to starve it on a switchback at the exact elevation where a man had no good options and nobody to flag down. Virgil saw it before he was fully off the kickstand. He had pulled into a wide gravel turnout near a creek crossing about halfway up the mountain road when the bike began to lose its steadiness. He knew the sound of a fuel problem, the way he knew his own breathing, and he killed the engine and swung his leg over and crouched beside the left side of the frame and looked at what someone had done. It was careful work, patient, the kind of mechanical sabotage that takes knowledge of the specific machine and time alone with it. His bike had been in the lot behind the shop, and there was a stretch of 2 days last week when he had gone home at night and left it there unlocked, because 40 years of no one touching your property teaches you habits that can eventually be used against you. He stood up. Atlas was already standing in the sidecar. His ears were forward, and his head was turning slowly from left to right, reading the air in segments. The fur along the ridge of his spine had come up. Virgil reached for the left saddlebag. His hand found the backup piece he had dropped there before leaving. He unzipped the bag and reached in and felt around the bottom and the sides. The gun had shifted during the ride, dropped through a gap between the bag's inner lining and the frame mount, and it was jammed somewhere he could not reach without tools and time. He had about 4 seconds. They came out of the tree line on both sides of the road. 4 men. Macklin in the center of the road coming from the uphill side. 2 men from the left shoulder of the turnout carrying pistols. One from the right with a length of steel pipe. The 3 men Virgil did not fully recognize had the look of hired workmen who showed up for a rate and a purpose and did not need to understand the history behind either. Macklin was smiling. It was not the smile of a man who was happy. It was the smile of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for weeks and was finally getting to perform it. Virgil stepped out of the sidecar onto the gravel. He stood straight. He put his hands at his sides. "Take a minute," he said. "Think about what you're doing." Macklin kept walking until he was close enough that Virgil could smell him. Whiskey, sweat underneath it, and something sharper below that, the particular chemical smell of a man running on adrenaline and certainty. "Virgil," Macklin said, "we've been thinking about it for 3 weeks. We are done thinking." The pipe came down across the backs of Virgil's knees before he could shift his weight. He went down hard. Both knees hit the gravel at the same moment, and then his palms came down trying to catch himself, and the gravel opened the skin across both hands. He had time for one breath before the sound arrived, the sound of Atlas already in the air. The dog had not barked. He had not growled. He had simply left the sidecar at the exact moment Virgil's knees hit the ground, which was before Virgil had consciously registered that he was falling, and he came off the left side of the sidecar at full extension and hit the nearest gunman by the wrist. The pistol went one direction. A portion of the wrist went another direction. The man made a sound that Virgil, even face down in the gravel with blood on his palms, registered as wrong as something a grown man's voice should not be capable of producing. Macklin was shouting, "Hit the dog! Get the dog!" The second pistol swung around toward Atlas. Virgil threw himself sideways and got his body over the dog's back. The shot went into the dirt somewhere between them. Then there was a boot against the side of Virgil's head, and the world lost its edges. For a moment went soft and ringing, and when it came back, he was face down with a knee in his spine and his wrists being pulled behind him. He could hear Atlas. The dog was still fighting, still snarling, the sound of it moving further away from him as someone dragged the animal back with a rope. Then a sharp yelp, short and clean, then nothing from that direction. A hand came into his hair and pulled his head up off the gravel. A voice near his ear said, "Don't worry about the dog. The dog is finished." Virgil did not answer. He was listening past that voice for any sound from Atlas, any continuation of the snarling or the movement, and there was none. Now, the man who did not shoot the dog. Of the 4 men Macklin had brought up that road, the one positioned farthest back on the right shoulder of the turn out was a man named Chet Dunbar. He was 40 years old with the kind of face that had been good-looking once and had since been worn into something harder by years of bad decisions compounding on one another. He was there because of a gambling debt that had been purchased by someone connected to Macklin. And that is the last I will say about how he got there, because the how is less important than the what. Dunbar had the second pistol. He was the one who had swung it toward Atlas when the dog came off the sidecar. He was the one whose finger was on the trigger when Virgil threw himself over the dog's back. Virgil's body had blocked the shot, but that was not the moment that mattered. The moment that mattered came a few seconds later, when Virgil was already pinned and Atlas was being pulled back on the rope, straining against it with his full weight, and the rope was around the dog's neck, and the dog was starting to lose the fight to breathe. Macklin was not paying attention to Dunbar. He was watching Virgil being secured, And in that gap, Dunbar raised the pistol, aimed at the ground approximately 12 inches to the left of Atlas's back paws, and fired once. The shot was close enough that Atlas felt the concussion in his legs. The dog twisted violently away from it, and the man holding the rope was not ready for the direction of the twist. And his grip slipped, and Atlas got 1 second of slack and used it. What happened in that second is not entirely clear even from the accounts given later. What is clear is that Atlas came out of the rope with a piece of it still around his neck, and with injuries that would have stopped most living things from moving at all. And what is also clear is that Chet Dunbar turned back to face Macklin's direction and said flatly, "It ran, it's gone." Macklin looked at him for a moment. Dunbar held the look. "Then it'll die in the woods," Macklin said. He went back to Virgil. Whether Dunbar had meant to miss or had simply been unable to do what he had been paid to do and had found the closest available alternative, he could not have told you with certainty. He was not sure himself. Some decisions get made below the level of conscious reasoning in the part of a man where whatever is left of him operates independently of the rest. It did not make him a good man. It made him a man who did one thing right inside a collection of things that were wrong and who would have to live with the arithmetic of that for the rest of his life. They put a hood over Virgil's head. They walked him to a truck. He heard 3 doors close, and then he was in the truck bed, and the hood was tied at the collar of his jacket so that no matter how he moved, his field of vision was the inside of canvas. He tried to track the route by feel. Pavement first, then the continuing climb of the mountain road, then a left turn onto something graveled, then a long stretch of gravel that gradually became rutted and uneven, then nothing recognizable as a road at all. The truck rocked across ground that had not been driven regularly enough to develop any kind of track. He counted approximately 45 minutes from the turnout to when the truck stopped. They lifted him out by the arms. His knees still did not work right from the pipe. He stumbled twice before they got him upright and moving. They took the hood off. The pines were so dense that the sky was visible only as a narrow gray strip between the canopy. The light that reached the ground was dim and sourceless, the kind of light that does not cast shadows. There was a tree nearby that was wider than 2 men standing side by side, the bark furrowed and gray with a logging chain already mounted to it at chest height by means of a steel bracket bolted into the wood. There were 4 padlocks in Macklin's right hand. They turned Virgil to face the tree and walked him back against it and began working the chain. 3 loops around his chest and upper arms. The chain fed down from there around his wrist, crossing and recrossing. The 4 padlocks went on at different points in the configuration, each one clicking shut with the particular sound of something being made permanent. Then the duct tape across his mouth pressed down firmly at the corners. Macklin stepped around to face him. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in the tone of a man delivering a prepared statement to an audience of one. "Virgil, I want you to listen carefully. Nobody is coming. You told Owen Gear you were going up to see Gordon Pruitt. Gordon Pruitt is in the trunk of his own car at the bottom of the lake behind his cabin. His wife is with him. The phone that made the call to your shop is in pieces in a drainage culvert 10 miles from here. Your bike is going to have been found on the road with the keys still in it. By the time anyone traces you up here, the coyotes will have finished what we started." He stood up. He patted Virgil's cheek once with the flat of his palm. Not hard, almost gentle. The gesture of a man who has already moved past the thing he is doing and is simply completing the final steps. "We left the dog up the trail about a mile," he said. "Figured you'd want something to think about while you go." He walked back toward the truck. The other men followed. Virgil heard the doors. He heard the engine catch. He heard the tires find the rutted ground and begin to move away from him, and then the sound of the engine diminishing through the trees until there was nothing left of it. And then there was only the forest. The pines made almost no sound. There was a faint movement of air somewhere in the upper canopy, but it did not reach the ground. The light was already changing. The narrow strip of sky visible between the treetops was darkening toward the gray-blue that comes before actual dark. Virgil worked the chain for a while. He worked it methodically, trying each configuration in sequence, pushing and rotating against each lock point, testing the bracket in the tree. He was not frantic about it. He was thorough. The chain was a heavy-gauge logging chain, and it had been mounted by someone who knew what they were doing. The bracket was lagged directly into the heartwood. The padlocks were quality. The tree was not going anywhere in any timeline that was relevant to him. He stopped trying. The blood from his wrist was finding the grooves in the chain links and running down through them. He could feel the temperature dropping through his jacket. The ground was still, and the silence was the particular silence of forest that is far enough from any road that even the ambient hum of civilization does not reach it. He thought about Gordon Pruitt, about Helen Pruitt, about a woman who had fed him venison stew without asking a single question about who he was or what he did or why her husband had spent 15 years doing it alongside him. She had just put the bowl down in front of him and said the biscuits were on the counter if he wanted them. He had wanted them. He had eaten 4. They were gone. They had been gone before he ever got in the truck. The call had not been made to lure him. The call had been made after they were already dead, using a voice that could approximate Pruitt's well enough to work on a man who wanted to believe it. He had known on some level. He had known and gone anyway. He thought about Margaret, not the last days of her, which he had not been present for. He thought about a specific Tuesday, maybe 15 years before the end, when she had asked him to come home early, and he had called at 6 in the evening to say the job was running long, and she had said all right, in a tone that contained no argument, no anger, just a settling, a slight lowering, the sound of a woman recalibrating her expectations downward by one more notch. He had noticed it at the time and had not addressed it because addressing it would have meant addressing everything, and he had not been ready for everything. He had never gotten ready. He thought about Kay, not the phone call after Margaret, something earlier, a Thursday evening when Kay was maybe 14 and had a school project. She wanted to show him something she had made out of cardboard and paint that represented the solar system, and he had come home late and she had fallen asleep at the kitchen table with the project beside her and a note that said, "Dad, can you look at this?" He had looked at it. He had thought it was good. He had gone to bed without waking her. He had thought about telling her it was good in the morning. He had not remembered in the morning. That was the particular arithmetic of his life. Not the large failures, not the absences during crises, but the accumulated weight of 10,000 small moments where he had chosen the road or the chapter or the work, and the people on the other side of those choices had learned quietly and without much drama to stop expecting him to choose them. The sky between the trees went from blue-gray to dark gray to a deep black, with a scatter of stars in the narrow strip overhead. A jay called once somewhere far off, then nothing. Virgil's head came down to his chest. His chin rested on the chain, his eyes closed. This is the moment I want to stay in for a moment because it matters. He was not giving up. That is not the right way to understand what happened when his eyes closed. Virgil Hatch had stopped being afraid of dying around year 5 on the road. What he was feeling now was not the anticipation of death. It was the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent a long time managing everything at a distance and has arrived at the place where there is nothing left to manage, where the instruments stop reading because there is nothing left to read. He thought about Travis Boone standing at the shop door for 15 minutes. He had not gone out. He had applied the protocol. Observe first. Act on information, not impression. It was the correct procedure for the job he had held for 11 years. But somewhere in the stillness of a pine forest with chain around his wrists and blood drying in the grooves of the links, the protocol looked different than it had in the shop. The procedure was correct. He had been correct. And a 24-year-old kid had stood on a step for 15 minutes trying to work up to something, and Virgil had watched through a warped glass window and waited for him to decide on his own. And the kid had not decided, and now Gordon Pruitt and Helen Pruitt were at the bottom of a lake. He was not wrong, he was something more complicated than wrong. He was a man who had spent so long being the kind of person who does not act on feeling that he had forgotten, in a specific inconsequential moment, that some things only happen if you go to the door. He had not gone to the door. His eyes closed. A branch cracked, somewhere to the left, back in the trees. He opened his eyes part way. He thought it was a night animal, something moving through underbrush. He let his eyes close again. Another crack, closer, and from a different direction than the first one. He opened his eyes fully now because the direction was wrong. The first sound had come from the left, which was the direction of the trail that led back toward where the truck had gone. The second sound came from behind the tree, from the dark space on the other side of the trunk. He understood what the first sound meant. Patient men come back to check their work. Macklin had not struck him as the kind of man who would lose sleep over uncertainty. He had left Virgil to die slow, but slow was the kind of outcome that required confirmation. They were coming back, maybe to move him deeper into the woods, maybe to finish it quickly and be certain. It did not make a significant difference. He had nothing left. His hands were locked behind a tree with chain and 4 padlocks, and he could not lift his head without effort. Whatever was coming around that trail bend, he had no answer for it. Then from behind him, from the direction of the second sound from the dark space on the far side of the trunk, a sound rose out of the silence. Low, settled, not a question and not a warning. Virgil Hatch recognized that sound in the same moment it reached him. He had heard it 3 times in 7 years. Once in the alley behind the shop when a stranger had reached toward the inside pocket of Virgil's jacket. Once in the parking lot of a diner off the county highway when a drunk had put his hands on the bike's handlebars. Once in the back room of a clubhouse when a visitor from another chapter had said the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong table. He knew what that sound meant. He did not need to reconsider it or contextualize it. He had learned it the way you learn the sound of a specific person's step on the stairs, immediately and permanently. He raised his head. Atlas came around the right side of the tree trunk. The dog's left side was the first thing Virgil saw, and it stopped him the way very few things in his life had ever stopped him. The ribs on that side were visible through a wound that was not a clean wound. It was a tearing, the kind of injury that comes from something serrated or from being dragged through something unyielding at speed. The fur around it was matted flat with dried blood that had gone almost black. There was a separate wound on the neck, high up a puncture that had bled heavily and had dried in a wide stain that covered the entire left side of the neck and one shoulder. The dog was walking on 3 legs, carrying the right foreleg slightly, and the walk was not quite a walk. It was the kind of movement that costs something with every sip and continues anyway. One eye was swollen, completely shut. The collar was gone. It had been ripped off, not unbuckled. But Atlas was alive. He had come. The dog moved the last few feet to where Virgil's hands were chained behind the tree and put his nose against the knuckles of Virgil's right hand. He held it there, not pressing, just present, warm breath against cold skin. The sound that came out of Virgil Hatch through the duct tape on his mouth was not a word. It was not close to a word. It was something that had been in him for a long time behind everything else, and it came out now because there was nothing left in the way. Atlas raised his head sharply. The growl came up from somewhere deep in the chest. It was not the same sound as a moment ago. It was heavier with a different quality to it, the sound a dog makes when the decision is already made and the body is simply notifying the environment. He moved out from behind the tree and placed himself between Virgil and the direction of the trail. Low to the ground, weight forward. The injured foreleg was carrying partial weight now placed deliberately. He was not standing the way a wounded animal stands. He was standing the way he had been built to stand when there was work ahead. Footsteps on the trail, 2 sets, unhurried. Macklin's voice keeping low. I told you I heard something. A second voice. Probably just the dog making noise dying. Let's confirm and go. They came around the bend in the trail and into the clearing. What they saw was Virgil against the tree, head down, eyes closed, the chain dark against his jacket. What they did not see was 90 pounds of Belgian Malinois pressed flat against the ground on their right, in the shadow below the first heavy branch of the pine already moving. Atlas hit the second man at the throat. The man's legs went out from under him, and he went backward into the pine needle ground with the full weight of the dog driving him, and the pistol he had been carrying discharged once upward into the canopy, and then lay somewhere in the dark. Macklin spun towards the sound. He had time to get his right hand on the pistol at his hip and get it halfway out before Atlas came off the second man and hit him from the left side from an angle that Macklin's body was not facing, and the dog took his right wrist. Not the throat, the wrist, the weapon hand. Macklin screamed. The pistol came out of his grip and hit the ground. He went to one knee. He brought his left fist around and hit Atlas on the side of the head. The dog's body shook with it, but the jaw did not open. He hit him again harder. The dog held. The second man was on his back in the pine needles. He was not going to be a problem in the next 60 seconds. Macklin was getting his left hand around behind his back, reaching for the waistband. Virgil watched from the tree. He saw the hand going for it. He tried to make a sound through the tape, tried to push any kind of warning through it, and what came out was nothing that reached anyone. The knife cleared its clip at the small of Macklin's back. It was a fixed blade, short and heavy, and Macklin brought it around in his left hand with the kind of speed that told you he had practiced that motion. Atlas released the wrist. He dropped his entire body low almost to the ground in the fraction of a second before the blade completed its arc. The knife passed through the space where his head had been. Atlas was already inside that space, already moving forward and upward, and he did what he had been built and trained and shaped over 4 years of police work to do when a human being with a free weapon arm presented the underside of their chin. He did it once. Macklin went sideways. He went down the way something goes down when it has no more instructions to give its own body. He hit the pine needle ground and stayed there, and the clearing went quiet all at once, the kind of quiet that follows something irreversible. Atlas stood over the place where Macklin had been for one breath, two. The dog was shaking. It was visible, even in the low light, a fine trembling that ran through the entire frame, the cost of what the body had just spent being presented in full. Blood was running down both of his shoulders now, the neck wound reopened by the effort. He took 2 steps that were not quite straight. Then he came to Virgil and placed his head against Virgil's leg below the knee and left it there. Virgil felt the dog's breath against his shin, fast, shallow. The breath of a body that had used most of what it had. The crying that came out of Virgil Hatch was the silent kind, the kind that men of his generation and his background allow themselves approximately twice in an entire life, if at all, and only when there is no audience, and only when something has happened that is too large to hold without letting some of it out. His hands were still locked behind the tree. He could not move them. He could feel the weight of the dog's head against his leg, and the warmth of it, and the shallow irregularity of each breath. He understood what had happened with a completeness that did not require any processing. The dog had been shot and beaten and left in a forest a mile up a trail. The dog had walked back through a mile of mountain woods with a gunshot wound and broken ribs and one eye swollen shut. The dog had come back, and it had waited until the men returned, and then it had handled the men, and now it had put its head against Virgil's leg. This is the part of the story that still gets told, not in any official record. In the back rooms of certain establishments around certain fires, among men who understand what it means, when something goes all the way past the reasonable limit of what a living creature can be expected to do. And then Atlas lifted his head. He turned it away from Virgil toward the trail. He held that position for a moment, then he began to walk. He walked past the body of the second man who was still breathing, but not moving purposefully. He walked past the dropped pistols, stepping around the nearest one without looking at it. He walked past the knife where it lay in the pine needles. He moved toward the tree line at the edge of the clearing in the direction of the trail that led down the mountain, and his gait was wrong, the injured leg giving slightly on every other step. But he kept moving, and the shadows of the trees closed around him. And then there was only the sound of something moving through underbrush, and then there was not even that. Virgil watched him go. The chain held him exactly where Macklin's men had left him. He could not take one step in any direction. He could not call through the tape. He could only watch the space between the trees where Atlas had entered and where there was now nothing, only dark. He thought the dog is going off to die alone. That is what they do. They go away from you because they do not want you to watch. He was wrong. What Virgil Hatch did not know, chained to that tree in 11 miles of nothing, was that the dog was not going to die. The dog had a route in its head. The dog had been building that route for 7 years, one road at a time, one familiar smell at a time, and the route did not end at the top of a mountain. The route ended at a building in a city 11 miles down from where they were standing. And that night, a Wednesday night, there were men in that building who did not know yet that Virgil had not come home. The dark settled fully over the clearing. The stars in the narrow strip of sky above the pines were cold and numerous. The blood on Virgil's wrists had stopped pulsing and gone tacky in the chain grooves. He was cold now, genuinely cold, the mountain air having found the gaps in his jacket and the sweat from the struggle having done its work against his core temperature. His chin came down to his chest. He was not unconscious. He was something adjacent to it. A state where the body conserves everything it has left by reducing the surface area of awareness to the minimum necessary to remain alive. 11 miles down the mountain at the end of a road, only the dog could navigate. A screen door on the back of a cigar bar had not yet been broken through. That was about to change. He went down the mountain on a straight line, not on the logging road, not along the trail that the truck had used. Atlas cut through the terrain the way water cuts through it, finding the path of least resistance between obstacles, while never deviating from the direction that mattered. The direction his nose told him was correct. The air was moving down the mountain in the hours after dark, carrying everything below with it. And the dog read that air the way it had been reading air for 7 years. The first creek was wide and running fast with recent rain. The water was cold enough that a man would have thought twice about crossing it. Atlas did not think twice. He went in at the bank, and the cold hit the open wound on his left side, and his body registered it as information rather than instruction. He swam with 3 legs doing the work and the 4th trailing, and the current took him downstream by maybe 30 feet before he found footing on the far bank. He came out of the water and shook once, which opened the neck wound further, and then he continued moving. The second obstacle was a working farm 2 miles below the creek line, a property that backed against the national forest with a wire fence separating the tree line from the pasture. Atlas went through the fence at the lowest point he could find, which was not low enough for a healthy dog, and was considerably less sufficient for a dog carrying the injuries he was carrying. He went through it anyway, leaving a small amount of fur and something darker on the wire's lowest strand. The farm had dogs, two of them sheepdogs of some mixed border collie variety, who picked up Atlas's scent before he was 20 yards into the pasture and came off the far side of the barn at a run, barking with the high sustained urgency of animals who have encountered something they cannot categorize. Atlas did not stop, did not alter his direction. He moved through the pasture with his head low and his pace unchanged, and the farm dogs circled him once, twice, keeping distance, confused by the combination of what they were smelling and what they were seeing, which was an animal that was clearly gravely injured and was nonetheless not behaving like an animal that knew it. The porch light of the farmhouse came on. A man came out onto the steps. He was older in work clothes, and he had a long gun in his right hand, held loosely pointed at the ground. He watched Atlas cross the pasture toward the far fence line. He watched the dog go through the fence at the bottom rail, not stopping, not looking back, and disappear into the tree line on the other side of the property. He stood on the porch for a moment after the dog was gone. Then he went back inside. He did not call anyone. He did not file a report. There are things that happen at the edge of a man's property in the dark that he understands are not his business, and a working farmer in this part of the country knows the shape of that category. The county two-lane highway was the third obstacle, and it was the one that almost ended everything. Atlas came out of the tree line onto the road's shoulder at the point where the shoulder was barely a foot wide before the asphalt began. He had approximately 60 feet of open road to cross. He went across it at his best available speed, which was not the speed he had been capable of 3 hours earlier, but was faster than it had any right to be. The propane truck was running without warning lights because the driver was running late, and the road was straight, and he had not seen another vehicle in 20 minutes. He saw Atlas at the last possible moment and got on his brakes, and the tires laid rubber across both lanes, and the truck stopped with its front bumper approximately 10 feet from where Atlas had already cleared the far shoulder and was back in the brush. The driver sat with his hands on the wheel for a full minute. He was a man in his 50s, heavy-set, who had driven propane trucks in this county for 19 years, and he had seen things on these roads. He told his wife about this particular thing when he got home that night, and he told a deputy who was not technically supposed to be asking him about it several weeks later, and both times he said the same thing: the dog had not turned its head. When the truck's lights hit it and the brakes went down and the sound filled the air, the dog had not flinched and had not looked at the truck. It had kept moving in the direction it was moving because it had somewhere to be, and the truck was not part of that calculation. 11 miles of mountain in a straight line. The shop on the east side of the city was dark and locked when Atlas arrived. Virgil had left it locked behind him that morning, and no one had opened it since. The dog went around the back of the building through the alley between the shop and the adjacent property, and across 2 residential yards without pausing at either fence, and came up against the rear fence of the property that backed against the block where the cigar bar sat. He went over that fence. He crossed the bar's back lot where 3 trucks were parked, and a single bulb burned over the rear entrance. The back door of the bar had a wooden frame and a screen insert that the chapter kept latched with a simple hook and eye latch. It was the kind of latch that was sufficient to keep the screen closed against an accidental bump, but was not designed to hold against anything with intent. Atlas hit the screen at full speed and came through it. He landed on the worn wooden floor of the bar's back hallway, and his back legs gave out from under him before he had taken a step. His front legs held for a moment, then they went too, and he went down on his belly on the floor and stayed there. He had made it. He had nothing left to make it further. The back room of the cigar bar was approximately 30 feet down the hallway. There were 6 men in it at a table: Owen Gear, Shelby, Crane, and 4 other patch holders whose names are their own business. They were not having a social meeting. They were talking about Virgil Hatch, specifically about the fact that Virgil had not appeared for the Wednesday meeting, and Virgil did not miss Wednesday meetings. Someone had called the shop twice. No answer. Someone had driven past it 20 minutes earlier, and the lights were off, and the bike was not in the lot. They heard the screen door come off its frame. They heard the impact of something hitting the hallway floor. Every man in the room came out of his chair. Crane was the first one through the doorway. Shelby Crane was 56 years old and had been an Army combat medic through 2 deployments in 2 different wars, and had seen the interior of more field trauma situations than he had ever attempted to count. He went down on his knees beside Atlas on the floor with the practiced efficiency of a man whose hands know what to do before his brain has finished processing the visual information. He saw the wound on the left side first. He saw the neck wound. He saw the one eye swollen completely shut. He saw when he put his hand under the dog's chin to lift its head enough to check the airway that there was something in the dog's teeth. Clamped there, a strip of denim dark blue approximately 4 inches wide, torn rather than cut. He worked it loose carefully. He held it up to the light from the hallway. It was a piece of a vest. The patch on it was partial torn along one edge, but enough remained to be recognizable to anyone who had been in the same chapter as the man who had worn it. It was not the chapter's patch. It was Brett Macklin's patch. Owen Gear was standing in the doorway. He looked at the patch in Crane's hand. He looked at the dog on the floor. He was quiet for approximately 3 seconds, which was longer than Gear usually needed to process anything. Then he said, "Virgil is on a tree somewhere. Get the trucks." That was all he said. The men in the room moved. They went through the back of the bar and into the lot, and the engine started within a minute of Gear's sentence. Crane stayed on the floor with the dog. He had his kit from the saddlebag of his bike, a flat case that contained more than a standard first aid kit by considerable margin, and he opened it on the floor beside Atlas and began working. He worked for just over 2 hours. He told me later, and I am telling you now, that the dog did not make a sound throughout the procedure, did not pull away, did not close its remaining good eye even during the portions of the treatment that should have produced an involuntary response. Crane said he had worked on men in the field who had not managed that level of stillness. He said it with the tone of a man who does not offer such comparisons easily. The dog had a job remaining. The dog understood this in whatever way dogs understand such things, not as abstract purpose, but as specific fact. The man was still out there, and the dog was the only one who knew where. When Crane had the bleeding controlled and the wounds dressed as well as could be managed on a bar floor, Atlas got up on 3 legs and walked to the hallway door. He stood there. Crane looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his kit, went through the building, and told the men in the lot to put the dog in the front cab of the lead truck. 6 trucks went up the mountain. Atlas sat in the passenger seat of the lead truck with his head against the window glass. Owen Gear drove. He did not speak. He kept his eyes on the road and both hands on the wheel, and let the dog do what the dog was going to do. At every fork and junction, he watched the dog's head. Atlas would shift his weight slightly toward one side of the seat, a small and deliberate lean that indicated direction, and Gear would turn that way. No hesitation, no second guessing. The dog had come 11 miles through mountain terrain with a gunshot wound and broken ribs to get to that bar, and the dog was now indicating left at this junction, and that was enough. It took an hour and 40 minutes. The headlights of the lead truck came around the final bend and filled the clearing with light, and Virgil Hatch was there against the tree, the chain still locked 4 ways around him, and his chin on his chest and his color wrong. But his chest was moving, barely, with the irregular rhythm of a body that is conserving everything. Gear was out of the truck before it had fully stopped. Crane came out of the second truck with a bolt cutter that was almost too large to carry in one hand and went directly to the chain. He worked the links from the bottom up, addressing each lock point in sequence. When the last section came free, Virgil's body came forward and Gear caught him before he reached the ground. Virgil's lips were cracked white at the corners, and his tongue had swollen against the inside of his mouth, and he could not produce clear speech. But he was trying. Gear held him and leaned close and listened. The same word repeated, "Atlas, Atlas, Atlas." Gear looked up toward the truck. Atlas had come down from the cab. He was crossing the clearing on 3 legs, the injured foreleg now holding some weight, but still not full weight, and his movement was deliberate rather than fast. He came to where Gear was holding Virgil, and he put his head against Virgil's chest exactly where the chain had been. Virgil's right hand came free of the cut chain. He laid it on top of the dog's head. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Nobody in that clearing said anything for a long time. I want to be specific about who was in that clearing that night. These were men with records, men who had made choices in their lives that they could not explain to a judge or a priest or their own children. Men who had spent decades operating in the spaces between legal and otherwise, who had built their identities around a particular kind of hardness. They had come up that mountain because one of their own was missing and a dog had shown them the way, and they were standing in the headlights with the trees behind them and 2 bodies in the pine needles that no one was looking at directly. Every one of them was crying, not performing it, not the kind of thing you wipe away quickly and pretend was something else. The real kind. The kind that comes when you witness something that is larger than the framework you have built around yourself to keep certain feelings at a manageable distance. There is nothing I can add to that image. I will leave it exactly as it was. They got Virgil down the mountain in the bed of Gear's truck with 2 men beside him. The question of a hospital was raised once and settled immediately. A hospital meant a staff who were required to ask questions. Questions required answers. Answers meant a deputy at the bedside within the hour asking about the chain and the dead men in the clearing and the 11 miles of national forest they had just driven through in the dark. None of those conversations were available to them. They went instead to a house on the western edge of the county that belonged to a woman named Norma Aldridge. Norma was 58 years old and had been a trauma nurse for 30 years. The last 12 of which had been in a level 1 trauma center in a mid-sized city before she retired early. She had retired early because her son had died in circumstances that connected at several removes to the kind of world the chapter operated in, and the chapter had handled certain matters related to those circumstances in ways that Norma had found acceptable. Since then, when the chapter brought her work, she received it without questions and applied 30 years of professional skill to it and sent them away when the work was done. She worked on Virgil for 6 hours. He had 3 broken ribs, one of which had moved and needed to be managed carefully. His right cheekbone had a fracture that would heal on its own given time. His left shoulder had been dislocated, which Norma reduced with the efficiency of someone who has done it many times and knows exactly where the resistance is. He had early hypothermia from the mountain temperatures and the blood loss. His wrists would scar in a pattern that would look for the rest of his life like something industrial had gotten hold of them. He was going to live. Crane worked on Atlas in the next room. The bullet had passed through the left side of the torso just below the spine through and through, missing the spinal column and the major vessels by margins that Crane described when he was asked about it later simply as enough. The ribs on that side were cracked in two places but had not displaced into the lung cavity. The neck wound was deep but had not compromised anything structural. The eye was swollen but intact. The shoulder wound was the most complex of the injuries in terms of tissue damage, but was, as Crane put it, clean. The dog slept for 2 days. On the morning of the third day, Atlas got off the blanket on the floor of the room where Crane had treated him, walked on 3 legs down the short hallway to the room where Virgil was lying in the bed that Norma had set up for him, and lay down on the floor beside the bed. He did not move from that position for 19 days. On the 4th day of Virgil's recovery, a car pulled up in front of Norma Aldridge's house that no one in the chapter recognized. Kay Hatch was 38 years old with short, dark hair and the kind of face that showed the history of having had to be practical about things from a young age. She was wearing a jacket that did not belong to anyone in Virgil's world, and she drove a compact sedan with Oregon plates. She parked in front of the house and sat in the car for a moment before she got out. No one had called her from the chapter. No one in the chapter had her number. Travis Boone had her number. He had found it in the back of a small address book in the top drawer of the workbench in Virgil's shop, a drawer that was never locked, a small, spiral-bound book with a worn cover and entries in Virgil's handwriting that covered maybe 30 names. Kay's name was near the front, written in ink that was slightly different in color from the surrounding entries added at a different time, possibly a different decade. The number beside it had a Portland area code. Travis had called her at 11 o'clock on the night he heard what had happened. He did not know everything. He knew enough. He told her that her father had been hurt, that he was being taken care of, and where. He told her this was the only thing he could think of that might make any part of what he had been involved in slightly less wrong. Kay sat in front of Norma Aldridge's house for perhaps 5 minutes. Then she got out of the car and knocked. Gear opened the door. He looked at her for a moment. She said who she was. He stepped back and let her in. She came into the room where Virgil was lying propped against the headboard with his wrists wrapped and his cheeks still swollen on the right side. Atlas was on the floor beside the bed and raised his head when she came in, registered her with a long look, and put his head back down. She sat in the chair beside the bed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Virgil said, his voice rough with disuse and the swelling that had not yet fully receded, "You didn't have to come." Kay said, "I know." That was the whole of it. No recriminations, no explanations offered or requested, no negotiation of the gap of 3 years or the longer gap. Before that, the gap of a childhood and an adolescence spent with a father who was present in the house in the way a piece of furniture is present. It was not a reconciliation. It was 2 people sitting in a room together and not leaving immediately, which was more than they had managed in some time. She stayed 2 days. When she left, she did not give a time for the next contact. Virgil did not ask for one. That night, he could not sleep. He lay in the dark with Atlas breathing beside the bed and thought about a Thursday evening when Kay was 14 and a cardboard solar system and a note that said, "Dad, can you look at this?" He thought about how he had looked at it and thought it was good and gone to bed without waking her. He thought about how he had intended to tell her in the morning and had not remembered. He did not sleep, but in the next morning he asked Norma to bring him a cup of coffee, and it was the first thing he had asked for since arriving. Norma brought it without comment. She understood that a man asking for coffee was a man coming back. Now, the rest of it. The 2 men in the clearing were never reported as missing by anyone who had standing to be listened to. Macklin had been disowned by his family years before any of this. The other man was hired work from out of state, connected to no local record that could be followed back. The bodies were handled by men who had been handling such matters for many years, and I am not going to tell you how because you do not need to know, and because the men who did it have earned the discretion. The remainder of Macklin's operation was a smaller problem without Macklin. Within 30 days, 2 of the 4 remaining members of his network turned themselves in to a federal task force. They understood what had happened to Macklin, and they did not want to wait for a similar accounting. One of them was Travis Boone. He walked into the task force's field office on a Tuesday morning and told them what he knew, which was enough to close one case and intersect with 2 others, and not enough to touch the chapter directly because Travis had been kept far enough from the chapter's actual operations that there was nothing connecting them to what he knew. He made an arrangement. He served time. He came out of it with a record he will carry for the rest of his life and the knowledge that the only thing he had done right in the entire situation was make one phone call to a woman in Portland. Virgil heard about Travis's decision 3 weeks after leaving Norma Aldridge's house. He was sitting in the shop the first week he had come back to the bench, and Gear told him. Virgil was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That kid stood at my door for 15 minutes and didn't knock." Gear said, "Yeah." Neither of them said anything further. Some things get named once and then left where they are. 3 days after the rescue, Chet Dunbar drove to Owen Gear's house alone. He parked on the street in front, not in the driveway. He left his jacket in the car. He walked to the front door and knocked and stood with his hands visible and his weight even on both feet when Gear came to the door. He said, "I was there. You know I was there. I wanted to say it to you before you heard it different from someone else." Gear looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked, "Did you shoot the dog?" Dunbar said, "No." Gear asked, "Did you save the dog?" Dunbar was quiet for a second. "I didn't shoot it." Gear considered this. He looked at Dunbar's face for another moment, reading whatever he needed to read there. Then he said, "Go." Dunbar went. He drove back the way he had come, and he did not stop for the first 20 miles. Gear went inside and did not explain his decision to anyone in the chapter, and no one asked. There are judgments that a man who leads a group like this makes not because they are correct by every available standard, but because they are the judgments he can live inside of, and Gear had made his. Gordon Pruitt and his wife were found by a state diver 3 weeks after the event in the lake behind the cabin, exactly where Macklin had said they would be. They were brought up and identified, and their families were notified, and arrangements were made. The chapter paid for the headstones without being asked and without asking for any acknowledgement. The service was small. Virgil stood at the back of it with Atlas beside him on a lead, and he did not speak because there was no word for standing at the grave of a man who was killed because he was used as the mechanism of your destruction, and no word for the particular weight of surviving that. He stood there until everyone else had left. Then he drove back down the mountain road. The chain, the actual logging chain that had been around his chest and wrists, was retrieved from the clearing by the men who went back to handle the other business. It was cut into 6 sections. One section was given to each of the 6 trucks that had come up that mountain the night of the rescue. The 6th section, the one that had been around Virgil's wrists, the one with the dark residue of his blood still visible in the grooves of the links, was hung on the wall of the back room of the cigar bar. Above it, someone had mounted a small brass plate. It had been drilled and screwed into the wall with care. The lettering was simple capital block letters, the kind you can order from a hardware store. He came back. No name, no date, no account of what had happened or who had been involved. Just 3 words that meant everything to anyone who had been in that clearing and meant nothing specific to anyone who had not. That was the intention. It was a memorial that explained itself only to the people who were already inside the explanation. Virgil recovered the way men of his background and generation recover from serious injury, slowly without complaint in the privacy of his own silence. By the third week, he was sitting up at the workbench for short periods. By the fifth week, he was walking to the back of the lot in the evenings. By the seventh week, he was back on the bike, first on short runs through the county roads, then longer. Atlas went with him. 3 legs at first, the injured foreleg held carefully, and then 4 as the weeks became months, with a stiffness in the shoulder, and the left side that never fully resolved, but that the dog accommodated so completely that you had to know what you were looking at to see it. 6 weeks into the recovery, Virgil's phone rang one evening in the shop. He picked it up, and a woman's voice said, "Dad, you okay?" He did not speak for 3 seconds. He said, "Yeah." She said, "Good." She hung up. He held the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he went to the contacts and added the number under the name K. He did not call it back that night. He did not call it back the following week or the week after. But the number was there in the phone, which was more than it had been before, and he checked it was still there occasionally without admitting to himself that he was checking. That was all that happened between them for a long time. Sometimes that is all that is available between two people who have spent years at a distance, and it has to be enough. Atlas lived 6 more years. He worked until he could not work, and then he rested, and the resting looked the same from the outside because rest and readiness look identical in a dog that has spent its whole life in the in-between state. The shoulder stiffness spread into the foreleg over the years, but it did not stop him from riding in the sidecar, or from following Virgil through the shop, or from lying under the workbench in his old position with a good eye tracking the room. He died on a Sunday afternoon. He had been lying near the workbench, and he shifted position, once moving slightly toward where Virgil was sitting on the floor doing work on the lower part of the frame, and he put his head down on top of Virgil's boot. The boot was steel-toed and heavy, and was not comfortable as a pillow by any reasonable measure. Atlas put his head there anyway and closed his eyes and did not open them again. Virgil sat on the floor of the shop with the dog's head on his boot for a long time before he did anything else. He buried Atlas under the oak tree behind the shop. He had put that tree in himself years ago as a seedling, so far back he no longer remembered the precise occasion. It was wide now, with a canopy that shaded the whole back corner of the lot in the afternoon. He dug the grave himself, which took longer than it should have, because of the rib that had never healed quite right, and he laid Atlas in it, and then he went to the left saddlebag and took out the K9 vest. He unfolded it. He had kept it pressed and clean for 7 years after Atlas stopped needing it the same way he had kept it before Atlas stopped needing it. He laid it over the dog, smoothing it flat across the body with both hands the way you would smooth a flag. He stood at the grave for a long time. Owen Gear came out of the shop at some point. He had been inside not by arrangement, just because Wednesday had become the day he sometimes stopped by the shop for no stated reason, and stayed for an hour, and this was a Wednesday. He came out and he saw Virgil at the grave, and he came across the lot and stood beside him and said nothing at all. After a while, Gear put his hand on Virgil's shoulder and left it there. Virgil spoke once, just one sentence. He said it to the oak tree and to the grave and to the evening air above both of them. He said he walked 11 miles for me. That was it. That was all of the eulogy. If you wanted to express the full truth of what Atlas had done on that mountain in a single sentence, that was the sentence. 11 miles on 3 legs, with a bullet hole in his side and broken ribs and one eye that would not open. Down a mountain in the dark, through a creek and across a farm, and past a propane truck that nearly ended it to a cigar bar on a Wednesday night, because Wednesday was when the men were there and the dog knew the schedule. 11 miles because his person was on a tree and that was reason enough. Gear stood beside Virgil until it was nearly full dark. Then he took his hand off Virgil's shoulder and went inside to get his jacket, and Virgil stayed at the grave a while longer before he followed. 3 years after Atlas died, Virgil Hatch's heart stopped in the shop on a weekday morning. He was 73. He was at the workbench, which is where he would have wanted to be, and it was a quick death, the kind that comes without much announcement to men who have spent their lives ignoring the smaller warnings that precede it. He was found within the hour. The chapter buried him under the oak tree beside Atlas. One stone over both of them, which was not the standard practice, but was the correct practice for this situation, and Gear said so and no one argued with him. The stone had both names on it, Virgil Hatch on the left, Atlas on the right, and above the names on its own line, the same 3 words that hung on the wall of the cigar bar's back room. He came back. No explanation, no dates, no account of the mountain or the chain or the 11 miles or the 6 trucks or the grown men in the clearing who could not keep their faces straight. Just the 3 words for anyone who already knew. I have told a lot of stories on this channel. Stories about men who rode and fought and made choices that could not always be explained to people who had not made them. Stories about loyalty between men, which is a specific and documented kind of loyalty that has its own literature and its own tradition and its own well-worn language. I will tell you this plainly. Nothing I have ever found in any of that literature or in any account given to me by any living person comes within reach of what that dog did on that mountain. A dog does not understand a chain. A dog does not understand betrayal or organizational politics, or what it means when a man you trusted turns out to have been calculating against you for months. A dog does not understand the 11 miles between a cigar bar and a clearing in the national forest, does not understand Wednesday nights or screen doors or the significance of a torn piece of denim in its teeth. A dog understands one thing. His person is on a tree, so he goes.